They found Private Kale Mirandan's dog tags in the wreckage of Forward Operating Station Theta 7, and that was the end of it. The tags were bent, heat-scorched, the serial number still legible under the char. The Vorkai had reduced the station to a carbon smear across a plateau that had no name in any human language, and the tags were the only thing left that said a man had ever stood there. His commanding officer filed the paperwork. His mother was notified. His name was added to a wall that was already crowded with names, and the war moved on without him. Kale Mirandan was not dead. He was crouched in an irrigation ditch 2 kilometers from where he was supposed to be dead, breathing slowly through his mouth, watching his own hands flicker. They kept doing that, flickering, like a faulty projector bulb. One moment he could see his knuckles, the pale crescents of his nails, the scar along his left index finger from a childhood accident involving a poorly maintained fence. The next moment, nothing. Just the ditch, the mud, the smell of alien soil that always reminded him faintly of copper and burnt sugar, and no hands at all. He had been inside the station's experimental wing when the Vorkai bombardment hit. He remembered light, a particular shade of blue-white that shouldn't have been possible from any natural source, and then the sensation of being pulled apart at a molecular level and reassembled slightly incorrectly. He'd woken up face down in the ditch, with his tags gone, and his body doing this. It took him 3 days to understand what had happened. The station had been testing a cloaking prototype, Vorkai-derived technology, reverse engineered from a downed scout craft, pushed through an array that was never meant to be fired under bombardment conditions. When the array took the hit, it discharged, fully directly into the one organic mass that happened to be standing closest to it, into Kale. The effect was incomplete. He wasn't fully invisible. He flickered, especially under stress or fatigue, a ghost that couldn't quite commit to haunting. But in low light, when he was calm, when he held very still and breathed very slowly, he was nothing. He was air. He was the space between things. He spent 3 weeks alone on that plateau, eating what he could scavenge from the edges of Vorkai supply lines, learning what his body could and could not do. He learned that fear made him visible. He learned that singing quietly, under his breath, helped him stay calm enough to hold the effect. Something about the rhythm of it, the small human ritual of it, the way his mother used to hum while cooking, that tuneless wandering melody that had no name and no end. He learned that the Vorkai could not hear well in the register of human speech, but that they could feel the pressure of it, a slight vibration in the air that made them turn and stare at nothing. He learned to stop singing. He did not learn to stop being afraid. He learned instead to let the fear run through him like water through a pipe. Present, moving, gone. On the 22nd day he made a decision. He was a dead man. Dead men had certain advantages. He walked into the Vorkai Regional Command installation at Orvith Station. He walked in through the main freight entrance, pressed flat against the hull of a resupply crawler as it passed through the scanner arch, and then stood in the middle of the receiving bay and watched 50 Vorkai move around him, and through him and past him, and not one of them turned their heads. The Vorkai were tall, nearly 3 meters, bipedal, but with a secondary pair of limbs folded against the duct that they used for fine manipulation. Like the world's worst engineers, given the world's most complicated set of arms. Their skin was a deep, matte gray, ridged along the spine and shoulders in a pattern that varied by caste. The command caste had ridges that curved inward, like parentheses, like something being held. The labor caste had flat, simple lines. He'd had this explained to him in a briefing once. He'd taken notes. He was glad now that he'd taken notes. He moved slowly. He breathed. He hummed nothing. Only the memory of a tune, only the shape of it in his chest with no sound attached. For 6 months, Kale Mirandan haunted Orvith Station. He lived in the maintenance shafts and the spaces between walls that the Vorkai used for cable routing, and that were sized for Vorkai limbs, but not for Vorkai bodies. He slept in 4-hour increments. He ate from storage bays and recycling units, and once, memorably, from the personal provisions cache of a senior commander named as far as he could render it in a human phoneme. Something like Veth Karal, who spent 3 days in increasing distress, convinced that the station had a contamination problem. He took notes. He had always been good at taking notes. The Vorkai communicated in 2 layers simultaneously, an acoustic layer that carried information and a chemical layer that carried emotional context. Without the chemical layer, their speech was flat, technical, stripped of nuance, a report without the subtext. He could only access the acoustic layer, but over 6 months. A dead man has a lot of time to listen, and Kale built a working lexicon from scratch using a method his secondary school linguistics teacher would have called invisible, but which worked. He matched acoustic patterns to observable behaviors and cross-referenced until the patterns resolved into meaning. It was slow. It was imprecise. But by the 3rd month, he understood approximately 60% of what he overheard, and by the 5th, he was at 82. He knew by the end of the 4th month that Orvith Station was the relay point for the Vorkai sector offensive. He knew the timetable. He knew the approach vectors. He knew that the commander of the operation, a figure he never saw directly but whose name occurred in briefings, with a weight that told him everything, was scheduled to arrive at Orvith in 43 days to personally oversee the jump coordinates for a strike on New Calcutta, a human colony of 200,000 people living on a world that the Vorkai had decided they needed for the rare earth deposits under its southern continent. He knew, because he had spent 6 months being dead, that he was in possession of the kind of information that could save 200,000 lives, and that getting it out meant somehow becoming visible again, in a way that the people he needed to reach would believe rather than shoot. The problem of being a ghost is not the haunting. The haunting is easy. The problem is the moment you need someone to know you're real. There was a human in Orvith Station. This surprised him more than anything else had. Her name was Dr. Priya Aluwalia, and she had been brought in under what the Vorkai called a research facilitation arrangement, and what every human definition of language would call a kidnapping. She was a xenogeochemist who had made the specific and professionally unfortunate achievement of being the world's foremost expert in Vorkai secondary communication, the chemical layer, the emotional subtext, which made her useful to them in the same way that a key is useful to a lock. She was helping them develop a long-range signal suppression system that would strip the emotional content from Vorkai command communications before they could be intercepted and analyzed. She was doing this because they had told her they would return her home when the work was complete, and she was smart enough to know that this was not true and doing it anyway, because the alternative was being permanently facilitated. She was kept in a research bay on level 4. She was given good food, by Vorkai standards, which she found largely inedible, and a sleeping area that was almost sized for a human, and 3 hours of recreation per day in a corridor that had a window. She went to the window every day. She stood there and looked at the sky, a sky the color of old pewter, the star too far and too cold, a sky that was definitionally not home, and she breathed. Kale watched her stand at that window for 2 weeks before he left her a note. He had thought about this for a long time. He had thought about what a note from a dead man would look like, and what it would do to a person who was already in a very delicate situation, and he had written 7 drafts in the margins of his private notebook before he arrived at something that was neither alarming nor dismissible. The final version said, "You are not alone in this station. I am a human soldier, alive and hidden. I need your help to get information out. Burn this when you've read it." Ghost, he slid it under the edge of her sleeping mat while she was at the window. She found it that evening. He watched her read it from the cable routing shaft above the research bay, watched her read it twice, slowly, and then sit very still for almost 4 minutes. The kind of stillness that is not calm but is controlled, the kind of stillness that a person achieves by deciding very deliberately not to fall apart. Then she burned it over the chemical analysis unit in the corner and went to bed. The next day, at the window, she said very quietly, looking at the sky, "If you're real, Tell me something only a real person would know. He was pressed into the shadow at the far end of the corridor, barely visible even to himself. He said, barely above a breath, "The sky over New Delhi in October turns the exact color of a copper coin about 10 minutes after sunset. Everyone who's seen it remembers it differently, but they all remember it." A long silence. Then, "My grandmother described it as bronze. Mine said gold, same sky." She kept looking at the pewter-colored alien sky. "I'm listening." It took 3 meetings, all conducted in whispers at the window during her recreation hours, for him to give her everything: the timetable, the approach vectors, the jump coordinates, the strike target. She memorized it in the way of a person, spent a career holding complex biochemical sequences in her head, methodically, without apparent effort, her eyes still on the sky. He learned during those 3 conversations that she had 2 sisters and a complicated relationship with her mother, and that she had been at Orvith for 14 months, and that she had once, in a very low moment, started to believe what the Vorkai said about the inevitability of their expansion, that humans were simply an earlier draft of a solution that the galaxy had since improved upon, and that she was angry at herself for having believed it, and that the anger had since become something cleaner and more useful. "How do you stay?" She paused, choosing the word present. "In there, alone." "I hum," he said, a pause. "What?" "To stay calm, to hold the effect. I hum something my mother used to hum. It doesn't have a name. I don't know where she got it from." Another pause. "That's the most human thing I've ever heard." "We're a very human species." She almost smiled. He could see the edge of it. "I'm going to request a laboratory transfer," she said. Level 2. The communication relay is on level 2. "I know. The relay has an exterior antenna array, military band encryption. If someone were to reconfigure the carrier frequency, I know how to do that. Then we have a plan." She looked at the sky one more time. 14 months, she said quietly, to no one in particular. "You'd better not be a very vivid hallucination." "I'm not dead," he said. "I've been working on proving it." The relay room was on level 2, accessible through a maintenance hatch that he had been using for months, adjacent to a cable trunk that ran warm with power and smelled of the particular ozone and copper mix that all Vorkai electrical systems produced. He went in at the end of the 3rd shift cycle, when the station was at its lowest staffing. He was as close to invisible as he had ever been. Tired and frightened enough that the fear had lapped over into something like stillness, a calm that came from having nothing left to lose. He worked by touch and by memory. His hands flickered in and out of existence as he moved them, which was deeply disconcerting, and he focused on the rhythm of it, the breathing, the memory of that tuneless melody, the copper smell, the warm cable. He had no tools. He had a length of wire he'd pulled from a recycling unit and a polymer stylus he'd taken from Vethkral's provisions cache along with the food, because dead men have no reason not to take what they need. The reconfiguration took 40 minutes. The encryption took another 12. He broadcast on the military band in the clear voice transmission because he had no way to generate a data signal, and he said everything he knew in the order he knew it. Place names and coordinates and timetable and strike target, and then he said his name and rank and serial number, and then he said, because he could think of nothing else, "I am Private Kale Mirandan," declared KIA at Theta 7, "and I am alive. And I have been inside Orvith Station for 173 years, and I need someone to come and get me and Dr. Priya Ahluwalia, and also I would very much like to see October in New Delhi again." He was shaking when he sealed the hatch. His hands were fully visible, and he couldn't make them stop. It took 11 days. The Vorkai did not detect the transmission. Or if they did, they processed it as an anomaly and moved on. Because they were not, it turned out, particularly good at accounting for the things they had already written off. Kale had been written off. Dr. Ahluwalia had been categorized, processed, and placed in a box labeled Ongoing Asset. The strike preparation continued on schedule. The commander came to Orvith as planned, 39 days after Kale's transmission, 3 days after a combined Hufen fleet. Using the approach vectors Kale had provided, he hit the Vorkai staging area at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability, the moment of jump alignment, when ships were locked in position and could not maneuver, and turned a sector offensive into a catastrophic loss. Kale was in the cable shaft when the station's alarms went off. He pressed himself flat against the wall and breathed. Below him, in the research bay, Dr. Ahluwalia put down her work carefully, covered her notes, and waited. The evacuation was chaotic. Vorkai command caste moved in the particular way of hierarchical creatures in crisis, decision-making collapsing upward, action freezing at every level. As each caste waited for orders from above, the whole structure seizing like an engine running without lubricant. Kale had seen this in his notes. He had written, "They are very good at executing plans and very bad at abandoning them." He went down to level 4. He had never been visible to her before. Always a voice, always a presence felt rather than seen. He came around the corner of the research bay, and she looked up from her covered notes, and for a moment he flickered. Fear, surprise, the particular vulnerability of being seen after 6 months of not being. And then he steadied. "You're shorter than I expected," she said. "You're exactly as I expected," he said. She stood up. She was wearing a Vorkai issue work garment that didn't fit her correctly, a length of copper-colored material that was cut for a body with a secondary limb set and hung oddly on a human frame. She had pulled her hair back in the particular way of people who have no access to proper hair ties and have improvised with whatever was available. She looked like a person who had been somewhere very difficult for a very long time and had not allowed it to change the essential fact of who she was. He knew the feeling. The evacuation corridor was 3 levels up. The Vorkai were moving in the wrong direction, toward the command levels, toward their collapsing hierarchy, away from the exterior hatches. Kale had spent 6 months learning where the exterior hatches were. They moved through the station with him, slightly ahead and slightly visible but dim. A presence at the edge of vision that the Vorkai registered as a system error and moved past, and her behind him, walking with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had decided not to run because running would make everything real. He found the hatch, he found the exterior, he found the plateau, gray and wide and smelling of copper and burnt sugar. And the air was cold, and the sky was the wrong color, and there was nothing beautiful about any of it, but it was outside, and they were in it, and they were alive. She stopped walking. She stood on the plateau, and she tilted her head back and looked at the alien sky, and she breathed, and for a moment he thought she might cry, and she didn't. She just breathed. "What now?" she asked. "We wait for pickup. I gave them coordinates. They should be here in..." He checked the internal count he'd been running since the alarms went off. "Less than an hour. The strike is pulling their attention inward. We're a secondary mission." "Secondary," she said. "Third, technically." She looked at him. "You spent 173 days inside their command station. 184 by now. And they never knew." He thought about that. About what it meant, really, that a single human, underpowered, undersupplied, running on scavenged food and a tuneless melody and a habit of taking careful notes, had lived inside the center of their operation, and they had never once looked in the right direction. Not because they were stupid. They weren't stupid, but because they had categorized him, processed him, put him in the box labeled resolved, and moved on. They knew. "I was dead," he said. "Dead things don't require attention. But you weren't dead." "No." He looked at the sky. "We're not very good at that as a species. Being dead, staying dead." He paused. "We're very stubborn about it." She almost smiled again. The edge of it, the held-back fullness of it, the specific expression of a person who has remembered how to find something funny after a long time of not finding anything funny. He recognized it because he had seen a version of it in himself, in Vorkai polished surfaces used as mirrors in the dark maintenance shafts. The slow, surprised return of the fact that a person is still a person, still capable of being amused, still capable of the specific human luxury of the absurdity in things that could also kill you. The pickup came in 53 minutes. A scout ship, fast and small, dropping through the wrong-colored sky with the particular grace of a craft designed for extraction rather than comfort. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 184 days. The pilot was a young woman who looked at Cale with an expression that he would later learn was the expression of someone who had read a KIA report and was now renegotiating their relationship with bureaucratic certainty. She said, "You're Mirandan? Last I checked, you're on the list as, I know what list I'm on." She looked at him for another moment, then at Dr. Ahluwalia, then back at him. Then she said, "Get in," which was the correct thing to say, and everything after that was the future. He was debriefed for 4 days by people who could not quite decide whether to be skeptical or awed and settled, practically, for just writing everything down. He gave them everything, the notes, the lexicon, the full intelligence package, and then he gave it again, and then a third time for a different room full of people who needed to hear it in a different order. He was not debriefed by Dr. Ahluwalia, who was debriefed separately, but on the second day she appeared in the corridor outside his debriefing room and handed him a cup of actual coffee. Real coffee, not the synthetic approximation he'd been living on, and said, "I told them about the humming." "You didn't." "I did. I told them that the reason you were able to maintain the cloaking effect under pronged stress was that you hummed your mother's melody to regulate your nervous system, and that this should be incorporated into the training protocol for any future operatives who undergo the same procedure." He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "They're going to put Hum Your Mother's Tune in the official protocol. With appropriate clinical language, yes." She paused. "They asked me what melody. I said I didn't know. I said it didn't have a name." He thought about his mother. He thought about the kitchen, the light through the window, the smell of things cooking, the melody that had no origin and no end, and that he had been carrying inside him for 184 days in the dark. He thought about how it had kept him here, how the small things, the tuneless human things, the unremarkable specific weight of being a person, had been the mechanism, not the technology, not the strategy, the song. "Neither do I," he said. She nodded, as if this were the correct answer. "October in New Delhi," she said. "When were you last there? 3 years ago?" "Before deployment. I go every year." "October, my grandmother's house." She paused. "Bronze sky, gold, same sky. She turned to leave. Get some sleep, soldier. You've been dead long enough." He slept for 14 hours. He dreamed of nothing. He woke up, and his hands were steady and fully visible, and the first thing he did was open the window, and the sky outside was the sky of a world where people knew his name, and it was the most ordinary miracle he had ever seen. New Calcutta held. 200,000 people went about their lives on a world with rare earth deposits under its southern continent, not knowing how close the margin had been, not knowing what had stood between them and the thing the Vorkai had planned. They did not know about the dead man in the maintenance shafts. They did not know about the woman at the window, memorizing coordinates into the same memory that held biochemical sequences and her grandmother's description of an October sky. They did not need to know. Some things do their work in the dark. Cale Mirandan was reclassified from KIA to active duty, which generated a remarkable quantity of paperwork and at least one very uncomfortable phone call to his mother, who handled it with the specific composure of a person who had already renegotiated her relationship with certainty once and was not willing to do it again on insufficient evidence. She called him instead of waiting to be called. She said, "You didn't write. I was a bit occupied. 184 days. I was working on something." A silence. Then, "Are you all right?" He thought about that. He thought about flickering hands and maintenance shafts and the smell of copper and burnt sugar and the tuneless melody that had no name and the woman who stood at the window every day and looked at the wrong sky and did not stop being herself. He thought about what it means to be written off and to refuse it, not loudly, not with declaration, but just by continuing to be there, taking notes, breathing, holding the thread of yourself in the dark, until there was light enough to follow it out. "Yes," he said, I'm working on it. She hummed. Just a few notes, the melody would name. He closed his eyes. Yeah, he said, that one. The Vorkai recalibrated after the Orvith loss. They were meticulous, systematic, and thorough in their analysis, and they developed 17 separate theories about the intelligence breach and investigated each one with the careful attention of a species that trusted process. They did not, in any of their 17 theories, include the possibility that a dead man had lived in their walls for 6 months, taking notes, eating their food, and humming a tune that had no name. They did not include it because they had categorized it, resolved it, put it in the box labeled impossible, and moved on. It was, Cale thought later, the most human advantage there was. Not the technology, not the training. The fact that humans did not stay in boxes they'd been put in. The fact that you could write one of them off, and they would spend half a year proving you wrong from inside your own walls. He wrote that down too. Old habits.